Brand new poll shows a virtual three-way tie for the Democratic nomination, with Sanders and Warren climbing up and Joe Biden dropping way down. What's behind the numbers? And will this change Biden's campaign tactics? We're taking a look on this edition of Politicking. Welcome to Politicking. I'm Matthew Cook, in for Larry King. A new Monmouth University poll released on Monday shows a big change to the Democratic presidential race since its last poll in June. The new poll of Democrats and Democratic-leaning voters across the U.S. has Senator Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in a virtual three-way tie with former Vice President Joe Biden. Mr. Biden is down across the board with voters of color, women voters, and voters under the age of 50, while Sanders and Warren are up with each of those groups. Now, we're going to note that this poll, like any that's out this early in the race, is just a snapshot in time. But it does show a more volatile race happening right now. So what's behind the numbers? And how worried should Joe Biden be? Let's start there with the political panel. They are Alex Vogel. He previously served as chief counsel to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist and former general counsel for the National Republican Senatorial Committee. He's in Washington, D.C. And in Bordentown, New Jersey, David Morey, Democratic strategist and former advisor to Barack Obama's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Good to be with you, Matthew.
So let's start with this poll. This is unbelievable. Reaction to Joe Biden's drop in numbers and the rise of Senators Warren and Sanders in the Monmouth University poll. Let's start with you, Alex.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, any poll is just a snapshot, especially national polls. Remember, we don't actually have a national election in this regard. We have individual state elections. But even that being said, in looking at the totality of the recent polling, you see a couple of things. You see, with the exception of this poll, Biden has maintained his front-runner status not only nationally, but in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, across the spectrum of early contests, number one. On the Sanders piece, what you have seen, frankly, is a fairly steady decline among his numbers to his current plateau. And in contrast, Elizabeth Warren has been steadily gaining. So to me, with the exception of the outlier that is this Monmouth poll, I think it shows some pretty consistent performance by Mr. Biden and a really resurgent campaign from Elizabeth Warren. The challenge for Biden is, if you're going to be the front runner, you're going to have to win and win early. And the truth is, a lot of his support, really remarkable support, if you consider some of the demographics at play, has been driven by an overwhelming advantage with African-American primary voters. There aren't many of those in Iowa and New Hampshire. That doesn't really kick in until South Carolina. So the question is, if Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders take a chunk out of the vice president in New Hampshire or in Iowa, can he survive that long enough to get his footing back? I think it's a fairly weak front-runner status right now.
It's interesting because this Monmouth poll is one of the four official DNC polls, so while it's statistically an outlier, at the same time, it's quite a mainstream poll. David, what's your reaction?
I agree with virtually everything Alex said. I thought that was a great analysis, Alex. I think this is one poll, as Alex said. This is a national poll. Remember, if Biden finishes second, third in Iowa or New Hampshire, it's almost over for him. I mean, it's a crisis, beyond crisis for him. This is the first one where his front-runner status has weakened. Shocking numbers under 50 for Biden, 6% support. I mean, really shocking. So I think this is symbolic of the resurgence of the Warren campaign, Sanders coming back. This really comes down to three people that look like they're in a realistic fight for the nomination now, and they're at the top of this poll: Biden, Sanders, Warren. I mean, someone can come up like a Booker or a Harris that we don't see yet in that sort of top tier group, but this thing is really starting to shape and find its consistency. I would make two more points. Warren and or Sanders aren't getting out of this race soon. You'd look at those numbers and say, wow, if one of them got out, the other one would really jump ahead. I don't think either of them are going to drop out of this race until the fat lady does sing, pardon my analogy. The second point is, people are wondering, if Biden can get through the nomination, is he in fact the best to go after Trump? versus a coastal elite, like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders? And that's a legitimate question. I think when you look at the 5, 6 states, we can go through them, Matt, that I think the nominee's going to have to win to beat Donald Trump next year.
Alex, do you agree?
I do agree. And the other thing that I find remarkable coming out of this polling has been, frankly, the decline of Kamala Harris in this race. She had a brief moment after the first debate where she famously took on Joe Biden on busing, much to his chagrin, and really surged and appeared set to become, given that bump plus her status as coming from California, as one of the real 2 or 3 top players in this race. Instead, seemingly out of nowhere, Tulsi Gabbard went after her on her criminal justice record in the next debate, and she really hasn't recovered from that. In fact, you've seen her numbers continue to slide. So I agree, it does feel like we are now coalescing around a fairly consistent top 3. And every day that goes by, it does get a lot harder for someone to come out of nowhere. There are certainly some insurgents out there, whether it's Booker, whether it's Mayor Pete. But again, it gets hard for them to break through when they're at 5, 6% among a number of candidates who were in the 20s or 30s or high teens. So the race does feel, even though it's still early, it feels like it's starting to come together.
More with Alex Vogel and David Morey right after this. Let's talk about Tulsi Gabbard for a moment. She's been very critical of the Democratic National Committee for essentially raising the threshold to qualify for the debates, the 3rd debate next month, which she may be now excluded. David, what are your thoughts?
She's a charismatic candidate. She, as Alex said, she was very effective attacking Harris. Taking his point a little further, I mean, I think Harris is a tremendous political athlete, but that sort of prepackaged attack on Biden in debate 1 it initially put her on the map, and they weren't sort of ready for all of that attention. And people are not just going to vote for a prosecutor; they're going to vote for a leader. And there was a sense that maybe that's the crux of her case, if you will. It is interesting that she's dropped down in the polls. And it's also true what Alex said. This is early in the process. Someone like a Klobuchar, who's got a lot of political talent, could surprise this Booker you mentioned. Harris could have a new rejuvenation. We just don't know this early in the process. But my guess, agreeing with Alex, is this thing is starting to solidify. In terms of Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, the perplexing thing about Gabbard to, I think, many observers is her position on Syria, which she refuses to back off on, in terms of Assad, who's one of the more evil villains in the universe, most of us think. And so that's kind of odd. And you're going to have debates. Tom Steyer needs one more poll. He's got 2 days to get there, to get to the debate stage in September. You're going to have arguments. The truth is you can't debate with 20 people, 10 and 10. I'm not even sure you can debate one night with 10 people. I mean, that's going to be a mess to begin with. And, at least you're going to get some of the, the chatter away, and you're going to get into the hardcore debates. I think the test will be, does Biden look strong? Can he rejuvenate? Can he bring new energy into the campaign, not just to be against Trump, but to be for a different kind of future? And can he articulate that to begin to get some support from those categories that have really plummeted on him?
If the DNC ends up, they're not going to fold and change their qualifications at this late in the game. So if Tulsi Gabbard doesn't end up qualifying, does she end up going and running as a third-party candidate? I think that would scare a lot of people. What do you think, Alex?
Well, I won't try and speak for the Congresswoman's intentions. I think she's not likely to have any appetite or success in the political marketplace as an independent. In an environment with 20 or 23 candidates, fairly diversely spread across the spectrum within the Democratic Party, it's not surprising you're going to have some folks who aren't happy if they don't meet the threshold, especially coming out of the last election with a whole lot of back and forth over whether the process was rigged and debate questions and the DNC's role and all that. So that ground is a little fertile, and some candidates are going to do that. I don't think there's a lot of appetite or window for independents. And the truth is, given what Gabbard's polling numbers are, even coming out of the strong performance against Harris, her numbers didn't move much. If she decided to run as a third-party candidate, I think the Democratic Party is likely to not be too upset. If Bernie Sanders did that or Elizabeth Warren did that, that obviously presents a real challenge. But in her context, I don't think it presents much of one.
What about the tone and the tenor of this contest, the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination thus far, compared to 2016? How does it look, David?
Well, one of the things I've said before, Matt, and you might disagree a little bit with this, we'll see, but I think one of the things the party has to be careful of is not to fall into the trap that they fell into after Reagan won, and they nominated Mondale and Dukakis, fairly left shall we say, I can't call them coastal elites because Mondale was not from the coast, but Minnesota. But the truth is, they were really hard left versus the electorate. The UK did the same thing when Thatcher won with Foot and Neil Kinnock. And so, I mean, the party, has had a tone and tenor issue in terms of appearing so far left that they're outside the mainstream of the key states they have to win. And by the way, let's remind ourselves, 4 states, 77,000 votes, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I would put 2 more states in that are all critical, Arizona and probably Florida. Whoever wins the majority of those wins. If the Democrats lose the majority of those, they lose. And Donald Trump has an interesting equation here, which does make him, I think, the front runner. He can lose the electoral vote by 3, maybe 4 points, and can still win electorally, similar to the way he did in 2016, can thread the needle. Whereas that's not the same for the Democrats. Democrats have to win by 3 or 4 points the popular vote to really get the electoral argument and coalition put together. So I think the tone and tenor is scary for some of us that worry about how this mainstream of the country is going to vote on issues of immigration, health care, Medicare for all, decriminalizing immigration, issues like that, which Trump is already beginning to go after them on.
Alex?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the other interesting, so there's 2 dynamics. There's the whether this primary drags the eventual nominee so far left in order to satisfy the primary electorate that he or she isn't viable. That's one issue. The other, from a tone perspective, is how these candidates interact with and attack each other as this process moves on. You're not going to have 22 or 23 people nicing each other to death to try and win the nomination. You're just not. They're going to have to contrast with each other. They're going to point out those differences. Sometimes those fights will be ugly. But you saw when Senator Harris went after Vice President Biden on race issues, you saw how uncomfortable people felt with the idea that they're going to knock each other around so much and point out so many flaws and weaknesses that they will ultimately do damage when their real goal from a party perspective is making sure someone with a D in front of their name wins this election. It is a challenge when you are out of power to ultimately get to that place where you're willing to put aside some ideological purity for the sake of electability. It's interesting that the Biden folks, and you saw these comments from Dr. Jill Biden the other day about electability, they're going to that early. And that may be a sign of weakness or concern about some of those issues, but it also reflects the reality that their goal is ultimately to put a Democrat in the office and not to, run into the ditch on the left-hand side of the road.
Alex, David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Pleasure, Matt.
More
Thank you, Alex.
politicking right after the break.